So in today's video, I am going to be talking about debt. If you've watched the channel for any period of time, you know that I've talked a lot about issues arising with the amount of debt that's being taken on in North America and around the world. But the focus of today's video and what I want to talk about is a little bit about how we got to this issue, why it's become an issue, and what a potential solution is to actually deal with the massive amount of government debt that is piling up pretty much everywhere. So the focus of today's video, I'm going to sort of talk mainly about the United States, mainly because it is an area that most people around the world are familiar with. They sort of know the facts related to it, but regardless of where you live, whether it's Canada, South America, Europe, the facts are more or less transferable between different countries. Most countries are in similar situations with different varying levels of problems when it comes to debt, but it's pretty much a worldwide problem at this point. And so, jumping right in, let's talk a little bit about how the United States, sort of their history of debt and how it became an issue. Well, if you actually look at sort of the amount of debt that the US government has taken on, obviously, as you probably should know, they've taken on a massive amount over the last couple of years, or few years. But if you look at the history, they have taken on debt in the past, but there was almost always a consistent sort of expectation that they would pay that debt off. So looking at sort of one of the spikes in the past, one of the first spikes that they had was during the Civil War. And as you often see with wartime periods, a government will borrow a lot of money so that they can pay for the war effort, and that happened in the Civil War. But if you looked after the Civil War, they paid off almost all of that debt. The government more or less got down to almost nothing, and then it spiked, as you might imagine, once again during World War I, another war, so they had to pay off the debt, or borrow debt, and then they started to pay it off afterwards. Then they got hit by the Great Depression. Again, debt sort of moved up, but again, they paid that off. There was an expectation that the government would pay off the debt that they borrowed during those periods when they needed it. And World War II, that was a massive spike in debt. It was a very long war, a very hard war, and so a huge amount of money was borrowed. But again, there was almost an expectation that the government would pay off these vast amounts of debt that they took on. They actually paid off a lot of it. But the problem is they didn't get back down to zero this time. After a couple of years, it started spiking again. But this time there was no war. There was no sort of trigger event like a Great Depression that caused them to start borrowing again. What happened was the government realized that we don't really need a specific issue to cause us to borrow. We can borrow whenever we want. This is basically free money. We can just borrow, let's say that we need to win an election somewhere next year. Well, we can just borrow money to pay for infrastructure, create jobs in the area, that will buy us votes. If we say need to win in Detroit, well, we can just borrow money, create hospitals, buy votes there. And they realized, specifically the government realized, that there really aren't any consequences for a government when it comes to borrowing. They can borrow money for whatever they want and whenever they need. And this sort of is a trend that has been going on since a couple of years after World War II, and it's continued on to nowadays. It's more or less consistently been growing. There's really not been an attempt to pay down the debt, and it's only getting worse as a problem. So that's sort of how they got there when it comes to a problem. Why did this happen? Well, it's sort of a comparison between the individual level and a government level when you look at debt. For an individual, me and you, there are consequences for being fiscally irresponsible. So let's say that you go to the bank to get a mortgage loan for your home. You want to buy a home. If you're irresponsible with that, if you take on too large a loan, something that you cannot actually pay back, what happens is you go bankrupt. You lose your home. You lose your car. You lose any money that you have saved up. You potentially have your wages garnished by creditors. You have to go through the bankruptcy process. There are significant consequences for you being irresponsible with your borrowing. That's at the individual level, for me and you. When you look at a government, there are no consequences. What happens when a government borrows money irresponsibly? Well, in most cases, they're only in power, in the case of America, for 4 to 8 years. And in most democracies around the world, governments change. Well, if you're only there for a short period of time, the only thing you have to worry about is, does the government default when you're in office? If it doesn't, you're fine. It's like a game of hot potato if you played this as a kid. All you have to worry about is not being the last president or administration in power when the country defaults. Otherwise, you're fine. There are no consequences to taking on all of this money and then spending it wherever you want. And so that's the main difference between sort of a personal level and a government level. On a personal level, you have consequences for your actions. On a government level, there are consequences, but in almost all cases, you're not going to have to face them. It's going to be somebody else's problem. You can push it off, so you do not have to worry about the issues that arise from that. And that is a huge problem. So you might be thinking, well, why did they only start borrowing money recently or in the last, say, 50 to 60 years, why did they only start borrowing money then if there were no consequences to it? Well, in the past, there were people that held the government accountable. In the past, when you look at, say, the American elections, fiscal responsibility, being responsible with money, was a huge issue in election cycles. People actually cared about that. But when you compare that to today, if sort of you follow the American election, or really any election around the world, fiscal responsibility, paying down the massive amounts of debt, in any reasonable plan, it is almost never mentioned. It doesn't compare with issues like national security, the economy. These things take precedent. And it seems almost like nobody cares about the issues about balancing budgets or paying down this debt. And so it's almost completely ignored by politicians. And that really isn't a fault of the government. That really isn't a fault of the politicians. That's a fault on us, because we are not making it clear that we care about governments being responsible with money. And we are not pushing this as a #1 issue, which it should be. Because you know what happens if the American government defaults on their debt? If they get too much money, too much debt sort of piled up and they have to go bankrupt, well, that's basically the end of the world as we know it. If the government fails, the American currency probably fails, the banking system fails, and in all honesty, you probably get a Mad Max type scenario. And the only people that are going to benefit from that are sort of preppers and people who have bunkers in the middle of nowhere. Everyone else, it's going to be a pretty bad situation. So realistically, fiscal responsibility, paying off the vast amounts of debt in North America and around the world should be a #1 issue, but it isn't. And again, that is not a fault of the politicians, that's a fault of us. We need, as a people, to start making fiscal responsibility a #1 issue again when it comes to elections. And it isn't. It's barely discussed at all. And it needs to be one of the #1 issues. Again, national security, it's important, for sure. The economy is important, for sure. But fiscal responsibility should definitely be a #1 issue up there with them. It should not be something that barely gets mentioned at all. And so how do we get out of this problem? We make our politicians understand that this is a #1 issue for us. And the way you do that is by reaching out to your politicians. Your local representatives, your state representatives, wherever you might live, let them know that you care about fiscal responsibility. And so to start the ball rolling, I've actually done that in the various areas or government levels that I have where I live. So the Mayor of Ottawa, Jim Watson, has consistently balanced his budget and being fairly fiscally responsible. So using you can check this if you want through the Finances Done Right Twitter account, I tweeted to him saying, "You have my vote in the next election because you have been fiscally responsible." It's important to make your politicians and your representatives know that you care about that. Even if you have politicians who are being responsible, tweet at them saying, "You're going to get my vote again because you've been a responsible politician." Make your politicians understand that this is a #1 issue. It should be, and it has to be. And the only way it changes is by getting your voice out there. So, at the next level, at the provincial level, there's the Liberal government. They have made some truly awful decisions when it comes to the finance and their plan, and it's pretty bad. And so I tweeted them saying, "You have lost my vote in the next election. There's no way you will get it because you have made terrible financial decisions. And as a response, you shouldn't get my vote." And then at the federal level, the Liberal government, it's a bit iffy. They're not there yet. They certainly don't have my vote yet, but they have time. And so I said, or I've tweeted rather, that in order to get my vote in the next election, you have to be fiscally responsible. And you have to have a plan to pay down this massive amount of debt that governments have accrued. And that is how we fix the problem when it comes to the debt crisis worldwide. You have to make paying down debt, fiscal responsibility a #1 issue when it comes to elections again. It used to be in the past. You look at sort of the American debt sort of rise and fall of the level of debt. In the past, there was an expectation that governments would be responsible. That was almost sort of a default thing. You didn't even have to worry about it. But nowadays you do, because they're not respecting that. They're not being responsible with money. So it's on us, the people, to make sure our governments know and care that financial responsibility is a #1 issue. And a final thing I want to say, just before I conclude the video, there's something that I hear a little bit, or a lot actually, and it's a very annoying statement. It's made by libertarians and conservatives. And it's not a fault on them at all, but there's sort of almost a characteristic associated with people who fall on that party line, and they say, I'm conservative because I expect fiscal responsibility out of my government, or I'm libertarian and I expect that out of my government. That should be something that everybody expects, regardless of whether you're a libertarian, you're conservative, you're a liberal, you're Green Party, whatever it is. The expectation should be that every government is fiscally responsible. That shouldn't be associated with 1 or 2 parties. That should be associated with every party. So again, get your voice out there. Make sure your politicians know that you care about fiscal responsibility, and you should care about fiscal responsibility. That should be a #1 issue. So get your voice out there and make a change, and that is really the only way we're ever going to see this debt crisis fixed, is by getting people to actually care about it.